Good evening, everyone. Country Flyboy here, and today, an extra video. This is sort of an amendment to the basic series tutorial. We'll call this one tutorial 1.5. So, I'm gonna real quick show you how to start the plane, and I'm gonna go into detail and explain better why you do certain things. So, real quick, I'm gonna shut the door. That one should be obvious as to why you do that. Now, I'm gonna go to the 2D cockpit so you can better see everything. Alright, so in the 2D cockpit, the layout in the virtual cockpit's about the same. Over here we have the magnetos, and that's the key, basically. The magnetos are the electrical source that runs the spark plugs for the engine. So, you have two of them. You have the right magneto and the left magneto. There's two of them for redundancy. Most of the time, in fact, all the time, you should be running off both magnetos. The reason you can select right and left is so you can check and make sure they're working. When you select one and only run off one magneto, there should be a drop in RPM as essentially half of the spark plugs are not working. Versus if you use the right, same thing happens. Both, you should see all cylinders or all spark plugs working and getting maximum performance from the engine. Now this red switch here labeled master is subdivided into two individual switches. We have alt and battery. This switch controls the alternator, the left one, and the right one is the battery. So the alternator, what this does is it closes the circuit to those various things. So if I just flip on the battery, what I've done is I've closed the circuit and making electrical power from the battery go. Now that only powers a few things. As you can see, it powers the gauges and it powers my enunciations up here. That's it. That's all it really powers up. The alternator is just that, closing the circuit to the alternator so that the alternator can provide electricity to the aircraft. Now these switches here on the bottom, fuel pump, beacon, land, taxi, nav, strobe, pitot heat, these are, first the fuel pump. Again, this is not going to work without the battery on. That is the auxiliary fuel pump. This is the electrical driven fuel pump. The aircraft has two fuel pumps in it. It has the engine-driven fuel pump, which is basically just running whenever the engine is running. But it also has an alternate electrical fuel pump that we can control with that switch. Now, the beacon, land, taxi, nav, and strobe, that refers to the external lights on the aircraft. So, beacon is the red light on the tail. Landing and taxi light is these two lights right here, and they shine a white light in front of us so we can see where we're going. The nav lights is the green, red, and white lights on the wingtip and tail. And the strobe lights are the white flashing lights on the wingtips. Okay, pitot heat is, if I can get us to a view that is usable. You see this little probe sticking out here on the wing? That's the pitot tube. Now what that is what basically measures your airspeed indicator. Now it does not measure ram air, it measures pressure. Basically all of the aircraft instruments, most of them, are pressure gauges. And the pitot tube gives you ram air pressure, and a static port down here, you can't really see it because of the terrible texturing, right there, that is the static port, which gives ambient air pressure. And the way the airspeed indicator works is you have ambient air pressure on one side and static air pressure, or the pitot tube air pressure on the other. And the airspeed indicates the difference between the two, basically, is how that works. So what this is basically a little tube. Now, insects like to get in there, but what can also happen is if you fly into icing conditions, ice can build up inside and on the pitot tube. So to melt that ice, there are heating elements inside the pitot tube that we can turn on or off with that switch right there. So that will warm the pitot tube up to melt any ice that's attached to it. Avionics, if I flip the battery back on, avionics is a bus. Basically, when I flip the battery on, only these gauges are powered. If I want to power the radios, I have to flip avionics on too, and that closes the circuit to the avionics bus so that the avionics can get powered. Okay, down here we have the panel light. This controls the panel light on the airplane. If you're flying at night, you're going to want to have that on so you can see the panel. Alternate static source here. We talked about a static port just a minute ago. There is a second static port inside the cockpit. Now the static port gives you static air pressure from outside the airplane. It can also become clogged though via insects or debris or whatever. So if it becomes clogged, your instruments up here will not work. So if it becomes clogged, you pull that, and that selects the alternate static air vent, which is actually underneath the panel in here. That way you're getting air pressure from a secondary source other than the main static port, and your instrument should come back to life. Now we have throttle here. This is the this is just like the throttle on a car, basically. You control how much air you're giving the engine with this. Now mixture controls the fuel-air mixture. You control how much fuel you're giving the engine with this. Flaps, takeoff trim. Now this here is the fuel shutoff valve, which we mentioned in that first video. This here will basically cut fuel to the engine. So if you look, the fuel tanks in this airplane are in the wing, and the fuel line runs from the wing struts here, or down these wing struts, down to the bottom. Now there's a series of screens and filters and reservoirs down there, but the last pipe, the last fuel line after the last reservoir before you hit the engine and it goes to the engine driven fuel pump, there's a shutoff valve controlled by that. So clicking that basically cuts fuel supply to the engine completely. Now the fuel selector here lets you decide which fuel tank you're running off of. So we have two wings, we have a left wing and a right wing, and the fuel tanks are inside the wings, so we have a left fuel tank and a right fuel tank. Usually, during most operations, you're going to be running on both. However, during cruise, it's a good idea to select the right or the left fuel tank, and you could run only off that fuel tank for the time. This can actually extend your range. Now, the Cessna 172 does tend to burn a little bit more from the right tank than it does the left tank. Now, also, when you're maneuvering, you only want to have both tanks on. Whenever you're doing maneuvers, or if you're going to be turning excessively, you need to have both tanks on, because these fuel tanks are gravity fed, and the fuel does slosh around inside the tanks. Now, there is a pipe up in the top up here that connects the two tanks, so fuel from one side when you're banking will slosh over to the other tank. Let's say if you were doing a bank to the left and you were only running off the right tank and you had, let's say, half the tanks, you could send all of your fuel from the left tank over to the right tank. Next thing you know, your engine dies. So when maneuvering, you need to have it on both tanks. Alright, real quick, let's go back to the virtual cockpit, and let's start the engine up. We should do it from the 2D. Alright, so this is how you would find the plane, cold and dark. To start the airplane up, you first need to turn on the battery. Now, you could turn just the battery on, or you can turn the alternator on too. Doesn't really matter. The alternator is not going to start working till the engine is running anyway. Next, you need to turn the beacon light on. Again, beacon light is the flashing red light on the tail. Now, what that does is that lets any ground personnel nearby know that you are about to start the engine. Next, we need to turn the magnetos to the both position. Make sure the fuel shutoff valve is on. We'll select both tanks and mixture to full rich. Then we will either have the parking brake selected or hold the brakes, and then we'll move the magnetos over to start. Now, when I do that, we'll hold them in the start position. The key is spring-loaded to return to the both position whenever you let go of it. So it's just like starting a car, basically, at that point. Now, once the engine is up and running, we'll increase the throttle, and we want to idle at about 900 to 1,000 revolutions per minute. Right about there. Here's your RPM gauge here. That's where you want to see it on the ground at idle. You should also see your oil pressure gauge rise up to just below green line within 30 seconds after starting the engine. If that does not rise up like it should, immediately cut off the engine because you have an oil leak or an oil system failure or something like that. has caused the oil system to not work. And you don't want to run the airplane with low oil pressure. So now that the airplane is up and running and the engine is good, we can turn on the avionics by flipping that switch. Again, closes the circuit to the avionics bus so our radios come on. And since the sun's going down, we'd want to flip on the nav lights too. A note on the lights. When you're flying VFR during the day, when you're on the ground, the only light you need on is the beacon light. Now, when you're taking off and landing, or anytime you're in the air, you need to have the strobe lights on too. And generally from takeoff to climb and top of descent to landing, I like to have the landing lights on as well. But once you're cruising in the air, you can actually turn the landing lights off. Now at night, we're required to have the navigation lights on so other airplanes can see us. But during the day, those are not required. I tend to turn it on if I'm flying IFR though. Alright, so that is the engine started up. Let's taxi on out to the runway. So since the sun's going down, I'll turn taxi light on. The brakes, and we're on a soft surface, so I'm going to give it full back pressure. If you're wondering why I'm pulling the yoke back, it's because we're taxiing across the turf, the soft surface of the ground, not a hard surface. So the air that is going over the prop is heading straight to the elevator and the vertical stabilizer. By pulling back like this, I'm taking weight off of the nose. Now once I get on the asphalt here, I can let off. Okay, so you see it's gotten dark. Let's flip our panel lights on. There, now we can see the panel. Alright, so that was starting the default Cessna 172, a complete walkthrough of what every switch does, why you push it, and when you push it. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.